Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/VMSPod or paypal.me/VMSPod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. Well, I've got all sorts of work projects going on, including writing the script for a half-hour presentation I have to record tomorrow for a trade show that, like everything else, has gone virtual this year. It's about the future of drug manufacturing, which, again, probably didn't interest too many of you until now that we're all concerned about manufacturing drugs and vaccines to treat COVID. But the key is, one of my slides at the beginning is a caveat that says the foreseeable future is not a thing, because the way I figure it, if it was foreseeable, it wouldn't really be the future. And anyone speaking on the same subject at last year's trade show sure as heck wouldn't have predicted anything mirroring where we are now. But the future ain't what it used to be, which brings us to this week's guest. Sheila Williams, the great editor of Asimov's science fiction magazine, joins the show to talk about the new anthology that she edited, Entanglements, Tomorrow's Lovers, Families, and Friends, from MIT Press. Entanglements is part of the 12 Tomorrows series from the press, and it features science fiction stories about relationships in a world constantly shaped and reshaped by technology. Now, Sheila and I talk more about what that means over the course of the conversation. So I'll just tell you something that comes up near the end. I loved this book and read it over the course of a Sunday afternoon and can't recommend it highly enough. I don't get to spend much time with short stories, especially by a variety of authors, as opposed to like a single author collection, just because of how the podcast sort of defines my reading choices. So it was an absolute joy to dive into a collection like this, filled with good writing, thoughtful takes on technology and what it does and doesn't change in our lives, and just the variety of inventive ways of telling stories that the writers evoke in this collection. Now, Entanglements features stories by, alphabetically, James Patrick Kelly, Mary Robinette Kowal, and I apologize for any mispronunciations here, Nancy Kress, Rich Larson, Sam J. Miller, Annalee Newitz, Suzanne Palmer, Cadwell Turnbull, Nick Walvin, and Sha Jia, translated by Ken Liu, as well as an interview with Nancy Kress. And it's also got this gorgeous artwork between each story by Tatiana Plakova. I really enjoyed the heck out of Entanglements, and I'm sort of looking forward to being at ReaderCon again someday and seeing someone's name badge and pausing for a moment before blurting out, "Oh, you wrote that great story for Sheila's book." And they're not going to know which book, because these people all actually write regularly and publish regularly, but still, I'm looking forward to that sort of moment. Now, Sheila's got a long history as an editor in the science fiction field, so it was a blast to talk with her, not just about Entanglements, but how this book sort of fits into her body of work, and how science fiction, well, how it's in a tension of creating new stories and finding new voices while respecting its own history. Anyway, let's get to the show. Here's Sheila's short bio, and there's a longer version at Asimov's. Sheila Williams is the multiple Hugo Award-winning editor of Asimov's science fiction magazine and the editor or co-editor of more than 24 anthologies. Her new anthology is Entanglements, Tomorrow's Lovers, Families, and Friends, from MIT Press. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Sheila Williams. How did Entanglements come together for you? And I know that's a broad question in terms of how it was pitched to you, but also how you pitched the stories to others. So tell me about the origins of Entanglements.
Okay, so to begin with, I got an email from MIT Press out of the blue, and they asked me if I'd be interested in doing the latest volume in their 12 Tomorrows series. And they said this would be the first time that they wanted to have a themed anthology. All of their books have had, all the stories have been hard science fiction, but they wanted to come up with a theme for the book. So I worked with my editor at MIT Press and the editor at MIT Tech Review. And to come up with the theme of emerging technologies' effect on human relationships. Which is, when one thinks about it, all of fiction is really about human relationships. But this was to explore technology's effect and its effect in the near future. So I pitched this to all the authors, and I gave them a wide range. I said it could be many different kinds of relationships, really any kind. It could be friendships, it could be family, it could be lovers. That just had to have something to do with technology. And so I had a pretty good, I had to be very selective in who I picked, based a lot on people I knew who wrote hard science fiction and could write about the future using technology.
Sure. Was there a limiting step in terms of people who were really focused on hard science fiction might not be the best people to understand what relationships are like? I'm just kidding.
That is a good point. I didn't think that. I think because of my work at Asimov's, I edit Asimov's science fiction magazine, and I've worked with a lot of authors who, we always say the main thing we're looking for at Asimov's is great characters, well-developed characters, which of course means you're going to have good human situations, but it's also a science fiction magazine. So we're looking for stories that are set in the future or have technology, et cetera. So I had worked with a lot of different authors who were quite good at that type of story. And MIT Press, the biggest limitation I had was that they said they didn't want me to use any authors who had been in just the very previous edition to that book, the 5th edition. They didn't mind if authors had been in the 1st through 4th. But so there were several authors. There were 3 on my list that I had to take off right away because they were in the previous edition. So that was my biggest limitation. But in terms of the authors, a lot of it I focused on, not in every case, but many of the authors were people I had worked with, and I was quite familiar with their work. Even someone like Annalee Newitt, who I hadn't worked with before, I was very familiar with their work.
Is there a difference between editing this sort of anthology versus editing either the magazine or the anthologies related to the magazine?
Yes, there are some big differences. So, okay, I'll start with the other anthologies I've done. I've done about 26 other anthologies. Either I've edited or I've co-edited. Co-edited quite a few with Gardner Dozois, and I've co-edited with other people as well. They were all reprint anthologies. So they were stories that had appeared either in Asimov's or in other publications that my company, Dell Magazines, publishes. So Analog Science Fiction or other magazines. So that's a big difference because there you can go through 20 years of stories to find the exact stories you want for a particular theme, say robots or the solar system or ghosts. But so that's very different from looking for original fiction that has to work in the anthology. In that regards, editing the anthology is somewhat similar to the magazine because the magazine is made up of all original stories. But the big difference is that at the magazine, I get about 800 stories a month, and I can buy about roughly 5 to 6 stories. So I'm quite confident that I'm going to see more than enough stories to publish in the magazine. And there's a deadline. I have to meet my deadlines, but I can buy from the stories keep coming in, so I can even buy ahead. At least I have faith in the world that those stories will show up, and they do on a regular basis. With the anthology, it's a little different. I was asking these 10 authors to write the stories for me, and basically pretty much hoping, I wasn't 100, if the stories hadn't worked, I wouldn't have been able to publish them. But I really didn't want to go through that kind of a, difficult situation. So I was really looking for people who I knew could turn in the type of work that I was looking for. And so it was much more narrow in what I could look for. But I had this great experience of having worked on the magazine all these years. So I knew there were so many wonderful authors out there that really I had way more than enough to people to approach.
Now, did you find...
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, go on. Yeah. No, mention the hard part.
Well, the hard part is narrowing it down.
Yeah. Were there challenges in particular? The book closes with a story in translation by, and I'm going to mangle the name, Xia Jia. When it comes to editing, were there issues in terms of working with an author in translation like that?
Well, that story was very interesting, and I had a great time. I learned a lot, but it was facilitated by the fact that the story was translated by Ken Liu, and he's an excellent writer, and he's an excellent translator. So I worked with both of them, though. I actually had a chance to meet Xia Jia in person before she wrote the story. And, we talked a little bit about some of her ideas. And then she wrote the story. It turns out it's the longest one in the book. And then Ken translated it. And then I had questions. I had some revisions, not major, but revisions that needed to be done. And then Ken was able to discuss that with Xia Jia and then come back with the revisions. So it was very smooth. And I don't know, it might have been equally as smooth with a different translator. Could have been that Xia Jia is just really great to work with, which I think is true. But I also think it was definitely facilitated by having someone as great to work with as Ken, too. So it was a very positive experience. And I also learned a little bit about the typography. One letter in the story is we kept from Chinese because it is both it's an image. So the image of the letter tells the story as well.
Yeah, the pictogram thing that is a very compelling story, and that certainly was key to including that typographically within it. So,
I love that.
There will be a long aside where we talk about the pandemic, but how did the pandemic impact the process of finishing this book, or were things pretty much done before March when things really went sideways for us?
Yes, the pandemics did not really impact the finishing of the book in most ways. I mean, I was working with a terrific copy editor, and we were doing the galleys electronically, Adobe. I had never done that before. It was a learning experience, and I have to say, and that was actually pre-pandemic. And then I had to do I did the book, copy edited. Then the galleys actually were during the pandemic, and I think I'm sure there were complications because everybody was doing things from home they would have done in the office, but I would have done that part of the book from home anyways. On an aside, having had that experience was incredibly useful for the work that Asimov's that we had to do with our own proofreader later. So that's another story, but it came in incredibly handy. So the other thing that happened, though, was that so all the production, the stories were long done. The production was closing in on being done. All of MIT Press was very professional. Everybody was working at home, but they were still able to pull everything off. Every deadline was met. But the book was originally scheduled to be released around the end of July, and they had to push it to September just because of the pandemic. So that was the biggest change. And of course, the other change for everyone is that I would be going to bookstores now, and I would be out talking about the book. My authors would be out, and we'd be going to conventions and promoting the book. And so that's hard. The camaraderie part is difficult, not having that. But I have had some great Zoom events. So it's been, everyone is making do the best they can.
Sure. Have you figured out your best Zoom angle yet? Did you have the laptop stacked up on like 12 books to angle it right?
My best Zoom angle is to sit up very straight, I find. If I slouch at all, I look terrible.
Yeah, I had no idea how much I was sloping one shoulder to the other until this, then I realized, oh my God, I'm always tilting down to my left. I really need to work on my posture more. So if there's anything positive that comes out of the pandemic, it's that.
Right. There are these, definitely.
But you've been in the editorial space within science fiction for about 40 years?
I started in publishing. I started at the magazine in 1983. Is that
nearly
right?
40?
And in June, 1982. I'm sorry, 1982, late June, as an editorial assistant. And my name first appears on Asimov's the January 1983 issue. So not quite 40 years, but but who's counting, right?
As close enough as anyone else will say 40 years, almost 4 decades, we'll say.
Right.
How has it changed? And I know it's a huge question. How have you changed? And we'll limit that to, as an editor.
Okay.
What's the time taught you?
Limiting it to the types of stories or the
however you want to answer. What has 40 years in editorial done to you, I guess?
Well, it's interesting. It's obvious you don't want to publish. I couldn't possibly publish the same story today, or all the same stories today that published in 1983. Or there are wonderful stories from that period that I'd be just as happy to reprint. But authors move forward, issues move forward, science moves forward, technology, all of that changes and moves forward, so that the stories that are written today, just by definition, really, they have to be different from the stories of the past. There can be stories that are, in a way, have an homage to angle of two past writers, but the fiction that comes in now is really representative of 2020, and that's just kind of normal. Now, the field clearly has become more. There were always diverse authors in the field, but I think the field's better at acknowledging and looking for voices from many different backgrounds now. And the readers are looking for that. The readers they always say they really love to read. Many readers will say, oh, give me the next Heinlein, but they don't really they love Heinlein, fine, but they really want something different now. They don't want a story retold, especially since Heinlein would have done it better than the person retelling him. So I find my readers are always very excited by new voices, and always get a lot of positive feedback on new writers. So they enjoy writers coming from all different backgrounds and looking at science and technology from many different angles, because a new writer brings in a new perspective, and the new perspective is one that the rest of us haven't thought of before. And that's what makes the story one of the things that makes a story very exciting. So
how much are, oh, go on. Yeah.
I guess is that an answer?
Everything's an answer. It's okay. I was wondering though, how much are younger readers, when you mention a Heinlein or someone along those lines, how much are the younger readers in tune with that lineage, I guess, that sense of history within SF?
The younger readers are not concerned much about the authors, say, of Heinlein, Asimov generation. They may have heard of them, but they have not necessarily grown up on them. And when they talk about who they grew up on, they're talking about Lois McMaster-Bujold or Connie Willis, or they're not going back that far, generally speaking. They're thinking Octavia Butler. They're thinking Kim Stanley Robinson. So they are. So what? Of course, I think of those people often as my contemporaries, but I realize that the kind of classic science fiction changes as the baton keeps being passed. So no, the younger readers aren't particularly, but they might be saying, why don't you have a story that if they're going to be harking back to their childhood, they'd be looking at their favorite authors. They're going to be thinking of something different. And that's why science fiction has to keep moving forward. It always has to move forward. We lose authors constantly to novel writing, or maybe they have a family, or they get a career that's different from their fiction, then they really launch into it. And so I've always lost short fiction writers to real world events. And so I've always had to find new people. And so there's really never been a time when the magazine could just coast on a stable of authors. Yeah. Yes, I have a lot of people who appear often, but I could never rely on just having those authors and having a magazine that I could put out.
Sure. Yeah, I wonder about that dynamic of trying to get greater diversity nowadays, which is critical to all of us, but at the same time, keeping that or fostering a sense of tradition, or at least an understanding or knowledge of what the history was leading into it. That's got to be a tough balancing act.
It is interesting because sometimes younger writers might think that no one else has ever done something before. And of course it was done, and then people got tired of it. But often the younger writers are bringing in a whole new perspective on how to do it. So that works out too. And it is interesting, though, because now, and of course it's been this way for a while, but I'm seeing it really flower that now that submissions come in electronically and digitally, they can come in from everywhere. So I'm getting stories from all over the world, and it's a lot easier than it would have been back when you had to put things in the mail and trust the mail and have your international reply coupon. So that's great. And I can work with authors everywhere. I can work with artists who are everywhere. It's pretty amazing.
What do you feel was the biggest lesson you had to learn as an editor?
As an editor?
Or is it an ongoing thing? But, go on. Yeah.
I guess I have to always remember to stay as open-minded to new ways of telling stories as possible. It's very easy for any one of us to become complacent about what we think is the right way to tell a story. And I think I've been fortunate that I have a pretty open mind about storytelling, but it's something that one has to remind oneself every so often. I think, it's just also, I have a good eye for really good stories from people I've never heard of before. One thing, when I'm reading for the magazine, I read the stories before I read the cover letters. So it really is the story that's selling itself to me. And I have found a lot of really great people, or even discovered people that other editors had already found, but it's because it's the story that always speaks to me. And stories I love that they're often very, very different from each other.
Is there and I put you on the spot, an author you are embarrassed that you missed or turned down? Or is it somewhat justified in terms of, well, the story they sent wasn't good, but they got better, down the line?
Well, that happens all the time. And I think every editor knows they're going to turn down a story that's going to win a Hugo Award or be nominated for a Nebula or something. That just happens. It's part of the territory. And, I can't say that I've ever been embarrassed by that. And sometimes I think, oh, was I reading too quickly? Did I miss something? And it's possible that I did. But that is part of the territory. I mean, I have to consider over 800 stories a month. So that can happen. And I can't beat myself up, or I could be just paralyzed in decision, I can't worry that everything I'm going to read. And also, I've seen a story that I might have passed on, and then I've seen an editor work with the author and turn it into a very different story that is has, the story that I read might not have gotten the attention. So I give credit to the editors too. And I've done the same in my experience, though I would never want that to be known which stories were which.
Oh, of course. Yeah. I won't put you on the spot that much. I know it's still it's a field where it's still about personal relationships and everybody knows each other.
Yes.
But that sense of editing, and helping an author reshape a story while still keeping their voice. Again, is there certain, did you get better at that over time?
Yeah,
Is it something that you recognize? Yeah.
It's true. At Asimov's, we have always had a pretty light hand. We always felt, if the story has to be pretty much working to be considered for Asimov's. And usually where I would want, I've had it, but with the newer writers, sometimes I have said, I really like the story, but then it went off. It just didn't work the direction it went in. Could you change? Can you work on, here's some suggestions. And I leave it up to the author to actually make those changes. And they almost always do. And there's been a couple of times where I made some further, well, this one didn't work. How about another approach? And then, I ended up buying the story after the second rewrite. And that would be very rare. And that would generally be with people who were kind of starting out. With established authors, I have a lighter hand because the work that comes in is usually pretty much completed, and I might be confused by something. I might ask for a revision to clarify something, or I might feel that something was contradictory, but it's not the same kind of hands-on heavy editing. And even, it's just not our philosophy to really be a big part of the story's creation.
Yeah, I have the story that I recorded with Otto Penzler at the Mysterious Bookshop last year, and he told this story of, this is novel publishing instead of short stories, but he got a mystery novel from Joyce Carol Oates that was terrible, and he just had no idea how to tell her or her agent this. He was so nervous about saying, this doesn't work at all. This is god awful. He finally got up the nerve and told the agent, and Joyce rewrote the thing, took every note, thought that every suggestion was perfect, and made a much better book out of it. But yeah, Otto just went into this, oh my God, what do I say? This is Joyce Carol Oates, but I can't publish this. This is god awful. And I again, won't put you on the spot. But yeah, that sense of just receiving something from someone, pantheon level, and just saying, this doesn't really work. That must be an occasional challenge for you.
Yeah. I've had a couple of situations where authors have asked me about, we've worked together on the story because they particularly wanted to make revisions, and, nothing to that extreme, though, I would say. Certainly not from an established author. I think that is also possibly because she wasn't as used to writing mysteries it could have been.
Yeah. I was just about to say, I think that might be quote unquote literary author trying to get into the genre.
Right. The literary author would probably send their science fiction to the New Yorker. I do get stories on occasion that, for authors, when I see their cover letter said, I've sold in all these literary magazines. But unless the story is working as a science fiction story, that doesn't really matter where they sold their stories. And I have asked those authors sometimes to make specific revisions because maybe the idea is not quite as original in science fiction as it would have been in a literary marketplace. And again, writers have been really great about working with me.
Cool. Tell me about your history with SF, where it began for you. And I'm glad it's primarily SF and not SFF, because I was always more of an SF guy than fantasy.
Well, I grew up, my father loved science fiction, and he actually didn't really care much for fantasy. And I think that put a little bias in me that I've overcome to some extent. But then again, what he considers science fiction, times change. So I grew up with him reading Edgar Rice Burroughs to me. And obviously Princess of Mars would not be science fiction in anyone's imagination nowadays. But that was my introduction to science fiction. And I just loved it. I loved it from, 5 years old. I didn't know there was something called science fiction. I just kind of noticed in middle school that the books that I read in the library and really liked had, a rocket ship symbol on their spine. And I started to figure out that those were the books I was going to find more enjoyment from. So I just was a fanatic, honestly, as a teenager. I founded the science fiction club in my high school. My high school invited me to help teach a 2-week science fiction class when I was a senior, and then to come back when I was a freshman in college and do the same thing. I founded the science fiction club in college. I went out to St. Louis to go to graduate school to study philosophy at Washington University, and the graduate student greeter invited me, said I could stay with him till I found an apartment. And he was a young grad student, a year or two ahead of me, and went out to dinner the first night with him and his girlfriend. And I started I don't know why, I started talking about science fiction. And she says, "Oh, George's father's a science fiction writer." And I realized his George Stubbs. Oh, Hal Clement. So, I was just really, really into science fiction. And then, but I was also I was thinking I was going to get a PhD in philosophy, but I realized eventually that I had to switch my vocation and my avocation and, come to New York and get that job in science fiction. And I think that it all calmed down when I was actually working in the field, because then I could have as much science fiction as I wanted. I could start reading other things as well.
But then you found 800 stories a month, and that becomes a little tougher.
Yeah, now please give me a mystery.
Do you find the philosophy background helped in any way, shape, or form, or was it just a road not traveled for you?
It definitely helps in the sense that you have to know how to construct and deconstruct an argument, and you have to be very analytical in writing philosophy papers, and that's really actually a great tool for analyzing stories, whether they work or not. It helps to be exposed to all kinds of ideas from the whole history of philosophy. Yes, The Good Place is my favorite TV show ever, but
we just did a rewatch of the whole shebang. The pandemic does that to us, but it was, why don't we just get back to The Good Place?
So I never regret it. And also I was on a full scholarship, so I didn't go into debt doing this. So I had no regrets. I got a master's degree, and then I just decided to, see if I could make it in publishing instead.
Yeah. Is there a sense that philosophy's concerns with consciousness in particular?
Oh, absolutely. My very first paper the very first paper I ever wrote, I wanted to take Intro to Philosophy, and the only course was a night class at my college that I could get into. And I had the most wonderful professor. And I ended up writing a paper on why robots can be and will be the next step in evolution. And it was all about consciousness, AI. This is back in 1974. So yes, oh, definitely philosophies. And, when I was reading, like Ted Chiang's The Story of Your Life, which has a lot to do with speech acts of, philosophy and linguistics. It definitely increases my enjoyment knowing often where the authors are coming from.
Yeah. And sometimes it'll help you figure out where they're going to go with the story because you know what the logical failings are or where something could fall. So
Right.
I get that occasionally in the pharmaceutical side of things just because of the weird vagaries of my day job. But that's me intruding on
it's often that I just have an idea of what direction they are going to go in because I know I know the sort of logical angle it's going to head in.
When we were talking about the way your role has changed over 37 years, is there a sense? I guess I wonder, over the past 20 years, everyone has become invested in technology, and especially in the last 10 years as the smartphone thing accelerated. We all seem to know something about tech in a way that I think we could say, again, when you were starting out, wasn't the case. The general populace just wasn't up to speed on technology and didn't have that direct involvement with things. Has that impacted either what sort of stories you get or what reader expectations are in terms of what hard science fiction can mean?
Well, it's an interesting thing because the problem with any kind of technology is great. And that's what this anthology is really about. I mean, you're really looking at these relationships through the lens of technological development. So whether the story involves home learning, homeschool learning, or a sex bot, the technology is a part of it. At the same time, you have to be careful with science fiction because in an anthology like this, it works very well. The authors are really exploring and experimenting. They're looking at, all kinds of angles, biology and botany and, and technology. But you can limit yourself by if you go with just today's technology, 2 years from now, that's going to be really dated. So,
sure.
Because things change so fast. So that it has to be done skillfully. I have a 27-year-old and an 18-year-old who are constantly letting me know how behind the times I am. and the 18-year-old, that's the 27-year-old, know how behind the times she is as well. So you have to watch for that in science fiction, that you don't want to have something that's just a little too close to what we have right now, because by the time it gets into print, you don't want it to be out of date also.
Understood. Yeah. And I was thinking less in terms of that direct application of technology, and I guess more about just the fact that every reader knows, what the technologies are nowadays or has some sense of that stuff. On the flip side, I remember installing the first computer in Samuel Delaney's apartment and discovering that Chip, as I put it, Mr. Science Fiction Genius couldn't figure out how to use Word. That was, it's almost 20 years ago and things were different back then. But
I know. I mean, I worked on Bill Gibson's Count Zero. We serialized it in Asimov's, and that was all written on a manual typewriter, and the H key was broken. So I had to draw in they all look like N's. I had to draw in, and this is Bill Gibson who had already written Neuromancer, but he wasn't working on, a word processor or a computer then. And so there are so many stories like that. I remember Isaac Asimov. He had that early Radio Shack computer, And he came in, he was cracking up. He said he couldn't get it to work, and he called the guy because he had this free repair service, and they came over, and then they went, "Oh, Dr. Asimov, you do have to plug it in." So yes, there are many stories like that. You know, that's just the way we are. On the other hand, I work with Jim Gunn, who is 95 years old, and he's great. He can handle everything. And, you know, he's still connected to the University of Kansas, so they'll suddenly change all their software, and he has to figure it all out. He does okay. It still writes the stories and sends them off to me. So certainly age and experience don't have to be a limitation by any means.
Sure. I know there's stereotypes or cliches about that. And I think I remember a story where Gibson had said when he finally got his first computer, he was just crushed at how loud it was, that he just figured everything would be silent. And when he had hard drives, clicking and clattering in the background and fans going on, it just ruined his illusion of all this stuff.
That was still the relatively newer computers, older computers then.
Yeah, back in the 80s, I think, when he finally splurged. But now, do you recall, I guess either through submissions or in-person meetings, authors you've melted down around because, holy crap, this is someone I idolized, and now I'm either editing their work or meeting them face to face?
Oh yeah, I mean that sadly is an experience I really don't get anymore. But it's been wonderful. I mean, to start with Isaac Asimov, I just grew up. I loved his work. I loved him, and then to actually be working for him was amazing. And then suddenly we were just friends, and that was gone. And it was just I could actually say, oh, I don't think this. I think you should edit this editorial. I think you need to change something here. And then, because sometimes he would write something and he might have been a little cranky. And then he started bringing stuff to me and asking me to read it before he sent it somewhere to make sure it wasn't, that he wasn't going to hurt someone's feelings or whatever. So that was an incredible switch. And I was still just the assistant editor at that time, but that was a great going from being just, in awe of him to being a friend. I'd say I felt the same way about Jim Gunn. I read The Listeners as a teenager, and I loved it so much. I gave it to my Unitarian minister to read. And I almost went to University of Kansas because he was teaching there. And years later, I was invited out to teach at his workshop, and to at least be a lecturer at his workshop. And it was just so exciting to have that, not a role reversal, but to be a peer of his.
Yeah, that sense of being in the cohort, I guess, being a peer. Yeah,
it's very exciting. And I've worked with Ursula Gwynn and many authors that I just actually, funny thing. Are you still there?
Yeah.
Okay. The funny thing, the first time I met Chip Delaney, I was in such awe of him that I was at a party and we started chatting, and he said, "Oh, you're from Western Massachusetts. I just started teaching up in that area. I love it." And I'm standing there like, oh my God. And then he says, "How are things at your magazine?" And I couldn't think what he was talking about. What magazine? Time? Newsweek? I hadn't, it just all went out of my head because I was talking to Samuel Delaney. And then he said, Asimov's. I said, oh, things are great.
Yeah, that magazine.
This is like 36 years ago, but it was so exciting, and now I'm definitely friends with him, but it was, oh my God, just to meet him was such an exciting moment.
Yeah,
I felt the same way. I never edited, but worked, actually I did edit, worked with Roger Zelazny, people that I grew up as a teenager, just in awe of. It's been a wonderful career that ways.
Yeah. My Chip experience, luckily I got to know him before I read his fiction. And because I was publishing a friend of his, we sat down. And so I knew his name, knew he was a big figure, but lucky for me, I didn't have the, the worship sense, because I've seen people have that same reaction you're talking about. And they are people you would not expect to melt the hell down around someone, but they just, oh my God, it's Samuel Delaney, and freak out. And I'm sure everybody's got their,
no, if you'd asked me my name at that moment, I wouldn't have been able to tell you.
And what helped for me was getting to know Chip before, I then started reading his work. That sort of inoculated me to almost any other freak out like this, because he's someone I got to know as a person and realize he's a person. He's a genius in his way, but a person. And anyone else I met down the line, I'm like, okay, just remember they're people. You met Chip before you knew who Chip really was. So,
yeah, no, that is sort of very helpful. And I have had such, the wonderful experiences with people like Chip ever since. And even that day, he was being so nice, because I was just pretty new to the field, and he was taking time to talk to me. And, even looking back at that, I thought he was very incredibly compassionate and kind, and putting up with me. And now he's asked me how my family is, whatever. Now we're, it's a very different, I've been in, it's everything. It's changed because I've been in the field for a long time, but I do love that feeling of excitement that, I do, that I can, when I think about the people who I met, that I was like, oh my God, this is, but yet it's much better to know authors as human beings, as artists, and as friends, than to be
too
idolizing them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's going to tie back to the question of how your pandemic is going, because not having, for me, I don't go to very many events, but ReaderCon was always my big one. I'd drive up to Massachusetts for that, and just sitting around on the patio with a couple of the old guys and shooting the breeze and realizing they don't need to know too much about me. These are just writers who I've enjoyed over the years. We just get to sit down and shoot the breeze for a while. Missing that, I guess, has been tough for me. How has it been for you adjusting to a year without in-person cons and festivals?
It's definitely, it's hard. I mean, I love that social angle, and I always kind of kid that my convention season basically runs from March to October, and it didn't happen this year at all. Clearly, I haven't been to a convention since last summer, and I usually would see authors who would come to New York because they'd be visiting their publishers, and go out to lunch or dinner. And I love to go to the readings. I went to all the Erewhon readings, and all other types of readings, and I just, I really do miss that. It's one of the things I've always loved about the field. It's an extra perk of the job. And I have stayed in communication. I've written a lot of emails back and forth. I felt a number of authors were very worried for me when New York's numbers were shooting so high, because I live in Manhattan, but I was never in any real danger, but it was very sweet. So many people got in touch to see how I was doing. And I miss seeing them, and I miss my own office. I miss working with my assistant, Emily Hockaday, who's a wonderful managing editor. I miss seeing her. And it is tough, but on the other hand, it's not as bad for me as it is for my daughter, who graduated from high school this past spring. So I didn't, I wasn't forced to miss all those activities, because at least editing is a job that I already was doing it from home 3 days a week.
Sure.
And so
that's having a built-in work from home had to be beneficial. So.
Yeah. There were things I had to change. We had to change how we did, because we had to do everything from home. But, the company sent me home my own laser printer, and, we just have figured it out like everyone else.
Do you find that the incoming stories are showing the influence of the pandemic?
Yes, some of them have. I mean, I feel before I've often published stories that had something to do with pandemics or plagues of one sort or another, but it's going to be a while before I can really publish a story that has to do with 2020 and the pandemic. But there will be a lot of stories about isolation. And I think those are going to, I think I've already bought stories like that without even realizing it. Because like everyone, authors are dealing with the isolation. And actually,
that's what I wondered more about
the latest story I bought from him.
Yeah.
You can imagine at 95 how isolated he was.
Yeah.
So.
God. Yeah, the background influence of it, I guess. That's what I was wondering, whether you're seeing things and you're like, this sort of story wouldn't have shown up before. I think
that's the best way to approach it right now, while we're still living it. Can't really write about something you're actually living in as well.
Sure.
But you can write about those side effects.
Now, when I recorded with Gordon Van Gelder a couple of years ago, at ReaderCon, in fact, although he only lives about 30 minutes away from me and we always talk about getting together, but never do, he mentioned in his life as an editor that there were patterns of stories that he wasn't recognizing until someone said to him, yeah, but every story you're buying has X, happening in it. And he realized, oh, I didn't realize I was doing that. Do you have those moments of stepping back and trying to figure out, whether you have sort of common themes yourself that you're not conscious of, that you need to step back and
I didn't realize that myself until it was similar experience. Chris Rush, who was a former editor of FNSF, said to me that she felt I really liked stories that had strong emotions in them. And the emotion could be any kind, happiness, sorrow, satisfaction, whatever. But I hadn't recognized that. And so I realized afterward that that's not true of every story I buy by any means, but it is probably true of the majority. And I have known editors that weren't as comfortable with that sort of story. So I don't know. That's like the one unifying thing that I can think of, because otherwise I am looking for each story to be different from the last one too, which is, probably what Gordon was thinking too. So it probably would take an outside person again to tell me, well, you actually get all your stories, or I don't know. I work so hard that every issue will be diverse, and I don't have, each issue is going to have at the most, one or maybe at the most two time travel stories, or, one, fantasy story, or unless it's my special issue, or one, alternate history story, or one, and I might have 3 spaceship stories, but that's okay as long as they're all different from each other. And then I'll find out I've worked so hard and I'll have 3 stories with a character named Jack. Which is not something I was anticipating. So it's like, you do what you can. I have an issue coming out, which I thought was very interesting, or it just came out, where one character, her father has just died and she's coping with that. And another story in the same issue where it's from the mother's point of view, and she's dying and she's trying to trying to figure out how she's going to tell her daughter. And I didn't intentionally put these 2 stories in the same issue, but I love that they looked at the same life event from the 2 very different, the opposite sides of the coin.
Yeah.
So that wasn't my intention, but I thought it worked really well in the issue.
Yeah, I think in Gordon's case, it was he was getting too many stories about fathers and sons and dealing with the dynamic and tension, which is a little more specific than strong emotions, as you were saying. But,
right.
I could imagine there was a point at which, another editor would say, these all have the same theme going on. And then you have to start psychoanalyzing yourself and blah, blah, blah. But
right. I mean, you have to watch it out. I do sometimes say, okay, I've had enough coming of age stories for a while, or I've had enough during the early days of the, Afghanistan and Iran. I had a lot of stories were torture, was being used abusively. And after I published the third one, I was like, I'm not publishing anymore. I don't care how good these stories are. We could have just too many. So that kind of thing can creep up on you too. And then you get a great story by someone where they've done it perfectly. And it's kind of, you don't really want to just reject it because you don't want to reject it because someone else dealt with that issue, as if the stories are really completely different from each other. But there can be a time when the theme seems to have been overdone.
Yeah. Now, in an older interview, you mentioned publishing things that, quote unquote, get you in trouble, get the magazine in trouble. Does that still come up? And has trouble changed in terms of either its definition or its fallout?
Oh, trouble changes all the time. And yes, I get in trouble all the time. I don't, I never necessarily know when it's going to happen. I mean, we've had stories that I thought were completely innocuous. And then, we got called on the carpet for, and other stories that I thought were going to really get people upset and no one even noticed, didn't hear a murmur. So, it's usually things come out of left field and I'm like, oh my God, I just didn't see that coming. But I think that is, again, that's the nature of publishing. You just have to kind of you have to be sensitive and try not to be deliberately, like, certainly not trying to offend people. But at the same time, literature does that. Literature looks at difficult situations and puts characters in difficult situations. And that is the price you pay as an editor. Is every so often you're going to walk into a minefield, but that's just part of the job, really. So it can be stressful, but it's, every time it's happened to me many times. And I see, whenever it happens to another editor, I think, well, they're, but for the grace, because it could be me next week, So I'm always very sympathetic because I think, well, just because it's not me this week doesn't mean it won't be, So.
Oh, but you developed enough of a thick skin to at least to know what the pattern's going to be of the freak out, the fallout, the backlash, and on to the next issue.
No one ever has a completely thick skin, I think, because, we're all human. But at least I know that there generally is a pattern and that people know I'm not, out there trying to stir up everyone, for no good reason. And so it's pretty much, but it's just going to happen. It's inevitable. As long as science fiction is out there on the forefront, looking at what the latest trends are and the latest concerns are, and everyone and readers are going to disagree on what the latest concerns are, and readers may even read something into a story that isn't even there, if it feel it is different from what they're thinking. But that doesn't happen too often, but it can happen. And so it's inevitable, but that's, fiction. It's exciting. That's one reason it's exciting. You just don't know. You can get in trouble for the same story that can win the Hugo Award or the Nebula Award. So it's, it's just the nature of the game.
And it keeps you engaged and excited after,
yes,
we'll say a lifetime in this field. Yeah,
very much. Yes.
Yes. So last question. Well, we're talking about tradition and legacy and all that stuff. Is there a particular author you try and make sure younger readers or writers get? Is there someone you foist off and say, I know you're the young generation, you don't need to know anything, but here's an author you really need to read before you set down this path?
Limiting me to one. I don't know about one. I mean,
Top five?
I feel like I always want them to know, Connie Willis. I think most of them know Octavia Butler, but they should if they don't. Again, obviously Chip. It's, they're just wonderful writers. But I I say you're going to have a great time reading this author, but I don't say you have to read this author because everyone's coming from their own, they coming from their own backgrounds, their own interests. But I will say, oh, I envy you that you haven't had that you are going to be reading this person for the first time, because that is a very exciting place to be. And they almost always come back and say to me, oh, wow, you are so right. So that is always quite gratifying.
Yeah. And that's, well, I mean, it's a weird way that I describe my life, but, I'm still, I approach 50, still in a mode where I can feel like a book or an author kind of changes my life. And that's, from what I gather, not typical for people nowadays. So, it's probably why I do this.
I can definitely think of a few like that in my life.
Yeah.
So it's been it's really been great doing that and having this career and being in this field. It's been wonderful.
Awesome.
And I'm continuing to do it. I have no intention of stopping. This anthology is so exciting.
Yeah. Are you looking at more
working on it, pulling it together?
Yeah, are you looking at more of those anthologies in addition to the Asimovs?
Nothing's in the works, but I would certainly be happy to do more. But it was a lot of fun, and it was great to develop some new skill sets at this point.
Yeah, that's also a big thing I've discovered is just not resting on one's laurels. I enjoyed the hell out of the collection because honestly, it had been so long because of the podcast. I tend not to read anthology short fiction because I'm usually reading a specific author and, doing long form dives into their stuff. So getting to sit down with Entanglements, I actually read it over the course of a day, 2 Saturdays ago. I just started and then, let me just read the next one and this interview and then the next one and the next. And then I was like, wow, that was interesting. I was just totally immersed in it. So it was a wonderful collection, and you brought together such great voices. So
thanks so much. I'm really glad you enjoyed it.
Cool. So the only downside is that I've only read it as a PDF. Now I've got to get it as a hard copy. And,
Well, and then someday, hopefully, I can autograph these books in real life out somewhere, and all my authors can.
Yeah, that's just what I was thinking. We've got to be able to just sit down in person again someday. So,
yes, I know. I'd love to be doing a panel on this book somewhere, but where you had an audience right in front of you. But that's for the future. It's a great topic in general, and I just and I would love to be seeing these authors. I had so much fun working with them, and I miss them.
Yeah. Understood. Sheila, thanks so much for coming on, and thanks for putting this book together.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
And that was Sheila Williams. Go read Entanglements, just out from MIT Press. It is a blast, and like I said, you may find yourself tearing through it in the course of an afternoon, which, now that I think about it, is sort of my reaction to the better science fiction of my youthful days. Now, you can check out Sheila's regular work at Asimov's Science Fiction magazine, where she serves as editor. That's at asimovs.com, which is ASIMOVS.com. She's on Twitter as Sheila William 10, but doesn't post there much. And she's also on Instagram as Sheila Williams _Asimovs, but same thing. But there'll be links to these in the show and episode notes, as well as a link to Entanglements. Now, in the before time, this is when I would bring up my Patreon and PayPal and ways you can support the show. But I don't want you to support the show financially. I want you to support the show by writing me the occasional email or letter or postcard. What I do want you to support financially are people and institutions in need. If it's individuals, then go find their Patreons, Kickstarters, Indiegogos, GoFundMes, tip jars, whatever. If you'd rather support institutions and you're in a position to help right now, then food banks, freedom funds, there are other charities. You can vet them to find out whether it's viable or a scam or something. There's also political contributions. I discovered I can't make political contributions to my presidential candidate of choice because I'm a registered lobbyist. So I had a lot of money refunded to me this month because I just wasn't thinking when I made my contributions. But the campaign looked up my name and realized I was I was persona non grata, I guess, when it comes to the grata. Anyway. Help people in need, help institutions in need. This is a world that needs fixing, and you can help fix it. Now, the only thing I do ask of people, if you are interested in what I write, whether that's poetry, essays, even excerpts of the podcast, you can check out my zine, Haiku for Business Travelers. First issue came out a few months ago. I am working on the second one. It is free. So just drop me an email, send me a note, or visit haikuforbusinesstravelers.com, and you can send me your contact info that way, and I will send you a print copy of a 32-page zine of my writing and photography. Like I say, it's free. You can kick in a few bucks for postage and production if you want, but not necessary. This is just about me sharing my art. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.